The war did not begin with a scream. It began with paperwork, forms signed in triplicate, budgets approved, supply chains organized, schedules maintained. Before the first shell landed, before the first village burned, before the first person was loaded into the first train car, there were desks. Men sitting at desks, reading documents, initialing columns, rubber-stamping requests. The machinery of the Second World War was not assembled from hatred alone. Hatred was the fuel, but the engine was something far more familiar. It was procedure. It was routine. It was the quiet compliance of institutions that had been functioning perfectly well before the war started and continued functioning perfectly well throughout it. Most people understand World War II through a framework of opposition. The good side and the bad side. The liberators and the oppressors. The heroes and the monsters. That framework is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter deeply. Because the moment you begin to look at the actual mechanics of how the war operated, on all sides, you start to see something that the framework cannot contain. You see that the most disturbing features of the war were not unique to any single nation. You see that bureaucratic normalization, the transformation of mass violence into administrative procedure, appeared wherever war operated at scale. You see that ordinary people with ordinary jobs, ordinary salaries, ordinary families waiting at home performed extraordinary acts of institutional violence without apparent conflict or crisis, not because they were uniquely evil, but because the system they worked inside had reclassified what they were doing into something manageable, something categorizable, something that fit inside a form. This is a narration about 24 events, decisions, and institutional realities from World War II that history has never fully explained. Not because the facts are missing. In most cases, the facts are available. The records exist. The documents survived. What history struggles to explain is the logic underneath the facts. The internal coherence of systems that produced outcomes so extreme they should have collapsed under their own weight, but did not. The 24 events described here are connected not by geography or by nation or by year, but by a shared quality. Each one represents a moment where the machinery of war continued operating exactly as designed, even when what it was producing was something no functional moral framework could absorb. There will be no heroes in this narration. There will be no villains in the cinematic sense. There will be institutions. There will be procedures. There will be men who filed reports, and there will be the outcomes of those reports, which were sometimes the deaths of thousands of people, sometimes the systematic erasure of inconvenient facts, sometimes the quiet burial of decisions that the historical record never fully recovered. The first event concerns a building in Berlin. The building was at 56-58 Prinz Albrecht Straße. Before the war, it had been a school of industrial arts. By 1934, it had been converted into the headquarters of the Gestapo. What is notable about this building is not what happened inside it, though what happened inside it was severe and well documented. What is notable is the administrative culture that surrounded it. The Gestapo at its peak employed approximately 32,000 people. Germany in 1939 had a population of roughly 80 million. This means that the secret state police that monitored, arrested, tortured, and processed the enemies of the regime operated with a ratio of roughly 1 agent per 2,500 citizens. By comparison, the East German Stasi, which is widely considered one of the most comprehensive surveillance states in modern history, eventually reached a ratio of 1 agent per 63 citizens. The Gestapo achieved its results not through omnipresence, but through something more efficient. It relied on denunciations. Ordinary citizens reported their neighbors, their co-workers, their family members, their acquaintances to the secret police. Historians who have examined the surviving Gestapo files estimate that the majority of cases that came to the organization originated not from Gestapo surveillance, but from voluntary civilian reports. People wrote letters, people made phone calls, people walked into offices and told agents what they had observed. The Gestapo processed the information. The machinery moved. What this means is that the surveillance state functioned largely because the population participated in it. Not under coercion in most cases, voluntarily, sometimes out of genuine ideological commitment, sometimes out of personal grievance, sometimes because reporting a neighbor created a practical advantage, sometimes for reasons the surviving documents do not record. The institution did not need to be everywhere. It needed only to exist as a destination for information that civilians were already willing to generate. That is not a story about monsters. That is a story about infrastructure. Moving east, and slightly earlier, to the summer of 1941, to a decision that shaped the entire course of the war in ways that historians continue to debate. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22nd of that year. It was the largest military operation in human history by nearly every measurable standard. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front that stretched approximately 2,900 kilometers. The operation was planned in detail over months. It had code names, phase lines, logistical schedules, supply projections. It was, by the standards of military planning, a document of considerable sophistication. And yet embedded within the plan was an assumption so catastrophically wrong that it is difficult even now to understand how it survived contact with basic arithmetic. The German planners assumed the campaign would be completed in 10 to 12 weeks. They based their supply calculations on that assumption. They did not plan for winter operations. They did not procure adequate cold weather equipment for their forces. The German army entered the Soviet Union in summer uniforms. When the autumn rains turned the roads to mud, and then the winter temperatures dropped to levels that froze engine oil and cracked rifle mechanisms and killed soldiers who had no adequate shelter, the Wehrmacht was encountering conditions that any competent study of the Russian winter could have predicted. The conditions were not secret. Napoleon's campaign of 1812 was not an obscure historical event. German military historians had access to the records. The planning failure was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of institutional willingness to incorporate unwelcome information into an existing plan. The plan had been approved. The assumptions had been ratified. Revising them would have required admitting that the timeline was wrong. And revising the timeline would have introduced complications that the institution did not want to process. So the assumption survived. And in the winter of 1941 to 1942, German soldiers died of cold in numbers that German medical records only partially captured because the records themselves were subject to institutional management. The Eastern Front produced another event that history has never comfortably explained. In late September and early October of 1941, German forces and their auxiliary units carried out a massacre at a ravine outside Kiev called Babi Yar. Over the course of 2 days, 33,071 Jewish civilians were killed. The operation was conducted according to a schedule. People were ordered to report to a specific location at a specific time, told to bring their documents and valuables, told they were being resettled. They arrived, were processed through a series of checkpoints, were directed to undress, were marched to the ravine's edge, and were shot. The logistics of moving over 30,000 people through a killing site in 2 days required coordination. It required personnel assignments. It required people directing crowds, people collecting valuables, people organizing the shooters, people managing the bodies. Afterward, a report was filed. The report described the operation in administrative language. It recorded the number of people killed. It was transmitted through official channels. It was received, read, and filed. Nobody in the chain of communication appears to have experienced the report as something requiring a response beyond acknowledgement. It was, within the institutional framework that produced it, a performance report. The operation had achieved its target. The paperwork reflected this. The document survived the war. It sits in an archive. It is legible. The question that history cannot fully answer is not what happened at Babi Yar. The facts of what happened are among the most thoroughly documented atrocities of the 20th century. The question is what it meant that a report describing the killing of 33,000 civilians in 48 hours was processed as routine administrative communication. What it meant that the institutional response to receiving that report was filing, not alarm, not investigation, filing. The institution had a category for this. The category had been created by other decisions, other reports, other operations, and the category functioned. The system that produced Babi Yar was not malfunctioning. It was operating exactly as the decisions made months and years earlier had designed it to operate. There is a related institutional reality that receives far less attention than the events it enabled. The question of who knew. Historians working with the surviving German administrative records have established that information about mass killings in the East circulated far more widely within the German state than post-war testimony generally acknowledged. Wehrmacht soldiers wrote letters home that described what they had witnessed. Some of those letters were read by military censors and were not suppressed, because suppressing them would have required creating a paper trail, acknowledging that the events described in them had occurred. Field reports went to divisional headquarters. Divisional reports went to Army Group headquarters. Army Group reports went to the High Command. The information moved through channels. It was received by people with the authority and institutional position to act on it. The post-war claim, advanced by significant numbers of German military and civilian officials, that they had not known the scale or nature of what was happening in the East, is not supported by the documentary evidence that survived. The more accurate institutional description is that information was received, categorized, and not acted upon. Not because the recipients lacked the information, but because acting upon it would have required a response the institution was not organized to produce. On the other side of the war in the Pacific Theater, an event occurred in December of 1937 that preceded the formal start of European hostilities by nearly 2 years, and that the historical narrative of World War II has never fully integrated. Japanese forces captured the Chinese city of Nanking, at the time the capital of the Republic of China, and over the following 6 to 8 weeks committed acts of mass violence against the civilian population and Chinese prisoners of war that contemporary witnesses documented extensively. Western diplomats, journalists, and business people who remained in the city during the occupation recorded what they observed. Diaries were kept, reports were filed with home governments, photographs were taken. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened after the war's end, documented the events in considerable detail. Estimates of the number of people killed range widely, from figures as low as 40,000 to figures exceeding 200,000. A range that reflects both the genuine difficulty of counting deaths in chaotic urban conditions and the political pressures that influenced later documentation efforts. What history has never fully explained is the institutional logic on the Japanese side. The violence at Nanking was not conducted in secret. It was conducted by uniformed military personnel. Officers were present. Command structures were operational. The violence occurred not despite the presence of military authority, but in some documented cases with the participation or direction of officers. The institution that permitted this was the same institution that maintained supply lines, conducted operational planning, and filed reports on enemy dispositions. It was a functioning military organization. The coexistence of operational military functionality with the mass killing of civilians was not a contradiction within the institution. It was a condition the institution accommodated without apparent structural crisis. The post-war Tokyo tribunals addressed some of what happened at Nanking. Several officers were convicted and executed. But the institutional analysis that would have examined how a functional military organization produced these conditions, what decisions at what levels enabled them, how the command culture created the conditions under which the violence occurred, was never fully completed. The tribunal focused on individual criminal responsibility. The institutional question, how a system rather than a collection of individuals produced Nanking, was addressed incompletely and has remained incompletely addressed. Returning to Europe, there is an event in the spring of 1940 that history has addressed extensively but never fully resolved at the institutional level. Between April and May of 1940, Soviet NKVD units killed approximately 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, police officials, and other members of the Polish educated and professional class who had been taken prisoner following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939. The killings were carried out at several locations, the most historically prominent of which is Katyn Forest, near Smolensk. The decision to conduct the killings was made at the highest levels of the Soviet state. A memorandum from NKVD Chief Lavrenti Beria to Stalin recommended the executions. Stalin approved it. The names of 4 other Politburo members appear on the approval document. The killings were then carried out methodically over several weeks. Prisoners were transported from holding facilities to execution sites. They were shot in the back of the head. The bodies were buried. Records were maintained within the NKVD, documenting the names, personal details, and execution dates of the individuals killed. These records were then classified at the highest security level and were not disclosed. When German forces advancing into Soviet territory in 1943 discovered mass graves in Katyn Forest, the Soviet government denied responsibility and attributed the killings to German forces. This denial was maintained officially by the Soviet Union for nearly 50 years. It was maintained through the period of the wartime alliance with Britain and the United States, during which Western governments that possessed intelligence suggesting Soviet responsibility chose not to formally challenge the Soviet denial because challenging it would have complicated the alliance. A British government inquiry that examined available evidence during the war concluded privately that Soviet responsibility was probable, but the conclusion was not published. The American government received similar intelligence assessments. The institutional decision in both cases was to manage the information rather than to act on it. The alliance was more valuable than the truth about 22,000 dead Polish officers. That calculus was made. It was made by people with names and titles. It was made in offices. The files documenting the intelligence assessments and the decisions about how to handle them exist in national archives and have been examined by historians. What history struggles to explain is not what happened or even who decided. What history struggles to explain is what it meant that democratic governments fighting a war partly defined by their opposition to authoritarian crimes, made institutional decisions to suppress evidence of an authoritarian crime because suppressing it was strategically convenient. The moral framework that justified the war did not apply uniformly to the actions of all parties to the war. The framework was selective. The selectivity was managed administratively. There is a program that operated within the United States during the war that occupies an uncomfortable position in the historical narrative of a nation that defined the war, partly in terms of freedom and democracy. In February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of persons of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States. Approximately 120,000 people were affected. The majority of them were American citizens. They were given short notice to dispose of their property, their businesses, and their possessions, and were transported to internment camps located in remote interior locations. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers were staffed. Residents required permission to leave. The program was administered by the War Relocation Authority, a federal agency with a budget, a staff, a director, and an organizational chart. The camps had administrative offices. Records were maintained. Daily operations followed procedures. The people inside the camps were processed through an institutional system that categorized them, assigned them housing, monitored their movements, and managed their labor. It was, in terms of its administrative structure, a functional government program. The Supreme Court of the United States upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion orders in 1944. The legal reasoning of the Korematsu decision, which affirmed the government's authority to exclude citizens from designated areas based on military necessity, remained technically on the books until 2018. when the Supreme Court in a different case explicitly repudiated the reasoning of Korematsu without overturning it through formal reversal, since there was no longer a live legal question before the court. What the program demonstrated was that the democratic and legal institutions of the United States, institutions that were simultaneously being used to justify a war against fascist and authoritarian states, were capable of producing a racially targeted incarceration program that processed citizens through administrative machinery without effective legal challenge. The institutions functioned. The program was implemented. The administrative records of the War Relocation Authority are extensive. They document intake procedures, housing assignments, work programs, and case management in the kind of detail that reflects a professionally administered government operation. The people inside the camps were, within the administrative framework, cases. Their incarceration was a program. The question of what happened to the property disposed of under duress by incarcerees, businesses sold at emergency prices, farms transferred at fractions of their value, household goods abandoned because there was no time to manage them properly, was never fully resolved. Redress legislation passed in 1988 provided a formal apology and modest financial payments to surviving incarcerees. The legislative record of the redress process documents the institutional acknowledgement that the program had been a grave injustice. What the legislation could not restore was what had been lost in the 46 years between the program's implementation and its formal repudiation. There is a medical program that operated within the Japanese military during the war, whose institutional history represents one of the most extensively documented and least publicly understood cases of wartime scientific atrocity. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that operated primarily in Manchuria, in the puppet state of Manchukuo, between 1935 and 1945. The unit conducted experiments on human subjects, the majority of whom were Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with Soviet, Korean, and Mongolian prisoners. The experiments included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid, and other pathogens. They included vivisection without anesthesia. They included pressure chamber experiments, frostbite experiments, and exposure to chemical and biological agents. The scale of the program and the number of people who died as subjects of its experiments is difficult to precisely establish because the unit destroyed many of its records when Japan surrendered. Estimates of total deaths from the experimental program range from several thousand to over 10,000. What history has never adequately explained is the post-war institutional decision made by the United States government regarding Unit 731's personnel and data. American military authorities and the Occupation Administration concluded that the data produced by Unit 731's experiments, data on the effects of biological and chemical agents on human subjects under controlled conditions that could not have been produced through ethical research methods, had significant military value. A decision was made to grant immunity from war crimes prosecution to the leadership of Unit 731, including its commander Shiro Ishii, in exchange for exclusive American access to the experimental data. Ishii and the principal researchers of Unit 731 were not prosecuted at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. They returned to civilian life in Japan. Some of them continued careers in medicine and public health. The data was transferred to American military research facilities. The institutional logic of the decision was that the intelligence value of the data outweighed the value of prosecuting the people who had produced it. The decision was made by named officials in identifiable positions within the American Occupation Administration. The documents describing the decision exist in American archives and have been examined by historians. What remains inadequately explained is how this decision was integrated into the institutional framework of an occupation administration that was simultaneously prosecuting Japanese military and political leaders for war crimes. The two programs operated concurrently. The people making the decisions about who would and would not be prosecuted were aware of both. The broader question of who was and was not prosecuted at the post-war war crimes tribunals is itself an institutional story that history has addressed only partially. The Tokyo Tribunal, formerly known as the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in 1946 and issued judgments in 1948. 25 defendants were convicted. 7 were executed. None of the defendants were members of the imperial family. Emperor Hirohito, in whose name the war had been fought and whose constitutional position as head of state gave him formal authority over military operations, was not indicted. The decision not to prosecute the emperor was made by American occupation authorities, primarily by General Douglas MacArthur, on the grounds that prosecution would destabilize the occupation and make administration of post-war Japan more difficult. The institutional logic was pragmatic. The imperial institution could be used to facilitate occupation governance. Its utility outweighed the legal and moral questions that prosecution would have raised. Documents describing the deliberations around the decision to protect the emperor from prosecution exist in American and Japanese archives. What they reveal is a decision-making process that was explicit about the trade-offs involved. The decision-makers were not unaware that they were choosing institutional utility over legal consistency. They made the choice with full knowledge of what it was. There is a program that operated within Nazi Germany whose full scope was not publicly understood for decades after the war's end, and whose institutional history reveals the bureaucratic mechanisms through which mass murder was administered. The program known as Action T4, named for the address of its administrative office at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, was a systematic program of killing people the regime had categorized as having lives unworthy of life. The program targeted people with physical and mental disabilities, psychiatric patients, people with genetic conditions the regime considered hereditary, and others deemed unfit for the society the regime was constructing. The program began in 1939 and, in its initial organized phase, continued until 1941. Estimates of the number of people killed in the organized phase range from 70,000 to 200,000. The program involved physicians, not just as passive participants, but as active decision-makers. Medical panels reviewed case files and made determinations about which individuals would be killed. The killing was carried out at facilities that had been repurposed for the purpose. The program was administered by a bureaucratic structure with offices, staff, budgets, and organizational charts. It maintained records. The records included the names of the people killed, their diagnoses, and the dates of their deaths. Death certificates were issued. The stated cause of death was fabricated. Letters were sent to families informing them that their relatives had died of natural causes. The letters were form letters with blanks for names and dates. They were produced in volume. What the T4 program demonstrated institutionally, and what historians who have studied it have emphasized, is the role of the medical profession in providing legitimacy to the killing. The program was structured to require physician authorization. The authorization requirement was not a moral safeguard. It was a legitimizing mechanism. By routing the killing decisions through medical authority, the program transformed what might otherwise have been recognized as murder into something that occupied a different institutional category. It was medical decision-making. It was clinical assessment. It operated within a professional framework with professional language and professional credentials attached to it. The physicians who participated in the T4 program did not, in most cases, experience institutional or professional consequences within Germany during the war. The professional culture of German medicine did not generate organized resistance to the program. Some individual physicians refused participation. The professional institutions of German medicine did not. The T4 program is also historically significant because the administrative techniques it developed, the use of dedicated facilities, the use of gas as the killing method in some locations, the administrative processing of victims through bureaucratic channels were later adapted and scaled for the killing programs that operated within the concentration and extermination camp system. Personnel from the T4 program were transferred to operations in occupied Poland. The institutional knowledge accumulated in T4 was applied at larger scale. The progression from T4 to the extermination camps is not a story about escalation from ordinary violence to extraordinary violence. It is a story about the transfer of institutional competency from one program to a larger one. There is a conference that took place in January of 1942 that history has addressed extensively, but whose institutional character continues to be discussed among historians of the Holocaust in ways that have not fully resolved. The Wannsee Conference took place on January 20th, 1942, at a villa on the shores of the Wannsee Lake outside Berlin. 15 senior officials of the Nazi regime attended. The meeting was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office. The stated purpose of the meeting was the coordination of what the official record of the meeting, which survived the war, described as the final solution to the Jewish question. The conference lasted approximately 90 minutes. It was followed by lunch. The Wannsee Protocol, the administrative record of the meeting, is 14 pages long. It describes in bureaucratic language the institutional arrangements for what was understood by all participants to be the systematic killing of the Jewish population of Europe. The protocol does not use the word killing directly in most passages. It uses administrative language that the participants understood to mean killing. The document was produced as an official record of a coordination meeting. Copies were distributed to the relevant agencies. What historians have debated about the Wannsee Conference is not what it decided, but what its decision-making status was. Was the conference the moment when the decision to pursue systematic killing was made? Or was it a coordination meeting convening to discuss the implementation of a decision that had already been made at higher levels? The documentary evidence suggests the latter. Mass killings had already begun in the occupied Soviet territories by the time of the conference. The death camps in occupied Poland were already in various stages of planning and construction. The conference was not a decision-making event in the sense that the attendees determined the policy. It was a coordination event in the sense that the attendees aligned their institutional operations with a policy that had been determined elsewhere and communicated to them through channels the historical record has not fully reconstructed. The most significant institutional feature of the Wannsee Conference may be precisely this, that 15 senior officials of a modern state, men with university educations, legal training, professional careers, could sit in a villa for 90 minutes, consume a formal lunch, and discuss the logistics of killing 11 million people using the vocabulary and professional norms of administrative coordination. The meeting generated paperwork. The paperwork was filed. The institutional machinery moved. There is a factual record concerning the Allied bombing campaigns of the Second World War that occupies a similarly uncomfortable position in the historical framework of the war as a contest between good and evil. The strategic bombing campaigns conducted by British and American air forces against Germany and German-occupied Europe killed between 300,000 and 600,000 civilians. The estimates vary depending on methodology and the specific populations counted. The bombing of German cities, which was explicitly designed in its British form to destroy civilian morale and residential infrastructure, rather than only military and industrial targets, is one of the most extensively documented aspects of the war's prosecution. The policy of area bombing, which directed bombers to destroy urban areas rather than specific industrial or military targets, was adopted by the British Bomber Command under Air Marshal Arthur Harris and was pursued systematically throughout the middle and later years of the war. The policy was not secret within the British government. It was debated. There were officials who argued that area bombing of residential districts served no clear military purpose. There were scientific advisors who presented analysis suggesting that the bombing was not achieving its stated objective of breaking civilian morale. The debates were documented. The policy continued. The bombing of Dresden in February of 1945 is the event within the Allied bombing campaign that has attracted the most historical attention, partly because of its scale, partly because of its timing, and partly because the city's pre-war cultural significance made its destruction symbolically legible in ways that the destruction of industrial cities was not. The firestorms created by the February 13th and 14th attacks on Dresden killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people, according to post-war German Historical Commission estimates. Earlier claims of far higher figures, some reaching into the hundreds of thousands, were not supported by the documentary evidence and have been revised downward by German historians working with the available records. What the Dresden bombing and the broader area bombing campaign demonstrated institutionally was that the Allied prosecution of the war operated according to a calculus that included the deliberate killing of large numbers of civilians as an acceptable and explicitly authorized operational choice. The institutional authorization was formal. The chain of command was documented. The policy had been approved at the highest levels of the Allied governments. The bombing crews who carried out the attacks were military personnel following authorized orders within a functioning command structure. The historical framework that positions the Allied prosecution of the war primarily in terms of liberation and defense of civilization has never fully integrated the area bombing campaign without resorting to necessity arguments that are themselves contested by the historical evidence about the campaign's military effectiveness. The Pacific Theater produced its own version of this institutional question, focused on the firebombing campaign conducted by the United States Army Air Forces against Japanese cities in the final year of the war. Beginning with the March 9th and 10th, 1945 raid on Tokyo, American B-29 bombers conducted incendiary attacks against Japanese urban areas using a strategy explicitly designed to destroy residential and commercial districts. The Tokyo raid of March 9th to 10th created a firestorm that killed approximately 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city. The campaign continued against other Japanese cities through the spring and summer of 1945. By the time the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, the firebombing campaign had already killed more people and destroyed more urban area than the two atomic attacks. The institutional record of the firebombing campaign includes the operational planning documents, the target selection criteria, the after-action reports, and the assessments of effectiveness. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the firebombing campaign, later stated in various public contexts that had the United States lost the war, he would have been prosecuted as a war criminal for the campaign's conduct. This statement was offered not as an expression of remorse, but as a recognition of the legal and moral contingency of the framework within which war crimes were defined and prosecuted. The institutional observation embedded in it that the definition of what constituted a war crime was determined by the outcome of the war rather than by any consistent application of legal or moral principle is not a comfortable one for the historical framework that the war's victors constructed. The development and use of atomic weapons represents an institutional history that contains several layers of inadequately explained decision-making. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bombs used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was an extraordinary exercise in institutional mobilization. At its peak, it employed over 130,000 people at facilities distributed across the United States and Canada. The scientists, engineers, construction workers, administrative staff, and military personnel who worked on the project operated within a security framework that prevented most of them from knowing the full scope of what they were contributing to. Compartmentalization was a design principle. Workers at specific facilities knew their own tasks, but not how their tasks connected to a larger system. The institutional effect of compartmentalization was that the moral question of what was being built was available for full consideration only to those at the top of the project's organizational structure. The majority of people whose labor produced the bombs did not have access to the information necessary to evaluate what they were producing. This was not accidental. It was a design choice. The decision to use the atomic bombs against Japanese cities was made through an institutional process that remains partially opaque. The Target Committee, a group of military and scientific officials, considered potential targets and established criteria. The criteria included a preference for cities that had not been extensively damaged by conventional bombing, so that the effect of the atomic bomb could be clearly assessed. The criteria included population density considerations. The cities selected, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were chosen partly because they were relatively intact and densely populated. The target selection criteria were documented in committee records. The decision to use the weapons without a prior demonstration, which some participating scientists argued for, was made at higher institutional levels through a process that the documentary record shows involved consideration of various options. The arguments against a demonstration were institutional and strategic. A demonstration that failed to produce Japanese surrender would have weakened the American negotiating position. The weapons were available. The infrastructure to deliver them existed. The institutional logic of using available weapons in the most impactful possible way was the logic of the organization that had spent 2 years and $2 billion building them. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killed approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately, and a comparable number in the following weeks and months from radiation effects, burns, and other injuries. The bombing of Nagasaki on August 9th killed approximately 40,000 people immediately, with comparable additional deaths in subsequent months. The institutional response to the use of the weapons within the American military and government was one of operational completion. The weapons had been used, the results had been observed, reports were filed, the Japanese government sued for peace. The institutional machinery of war termination began to operate. The scientists who had built the weapons had varying responses to their use, from satisfaction to dismay to extended moral reckoning. Their responses were individual and are documented in memoirs, letters, and interviews. The institutional response was procedural. There is a post-war institutional history connected to the scientists and technical experts from the German weapons programs that has never been adequately integrated into the historical framework of the war's moral stakes. Operation Paperclip was a United States government program that recruited German scientists, engineers, and technical experts, including individuals who had been members of the Nazi Party, individuals who had used forced labor in their wartime programs, and individuals who had been investigated for war crimes, for employment in American government and military research programs. The program recruited over 1,600 individuals. Werner von Braun, who led the V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde and whose program used concentration camp labor, was among the most prominent. Von Braun became a central figure in the American space program. He received the National Medal of Science in 1975. The institutional process by which his wartime record was managed involved the modification of immigration documents to remove or obscure information about his Nazi Party membership and his involvement with forced labor. This modification was not the action of rogue officials. It was conducted by American intelligence and military officials operating within an institutional framework that had determined the scientific and technical value of the recruits outweighed the legal and moral complications of their wartime records. The competing program, Operation Osoaviakhim, conducted by the Soviet Union in October of 1946, forcibly transferred approximately 2,500 German specialists, along with their families, to the Soviet Union for similar purposes. Both the American and Soviet programs reflected the same institutional logic applied by competing institutional frameworks. The scientific and technical knowledge accumulated by the German weapons programs had strategic value. The strategic value determined the institutional response to the moral complications. There is a dimension of the war's institutional history that concerns what was erased rather than what was preserved. The German government conducted extensive destruction of administrative records as the war approached its end. SS units destroyed records. Individual officials burned files. The administrative record of the Holocaust, which had been maintained in extraordinary detail through most of the war, was subjected to systematic destruction. That means the surviving record, extensive as it is, represents only a fraction of what was generated. The destruction was not complete. Enough survived to document the system's operation. But the gaps in the surviving record mean that the institutional history of specific programs and specific decisions must be reconstructed from partial evidence, which creates permanent uncertainty about details that would otherwise be answerable. The deliberate destruction of the record was itself an institutional act. It was conducted according to priorities. Some records were more urgently destroyed than others. The prioritization reflected institutional judgments about what was most incriminating. Those judgments were made by people who understood the institutional significance of what they were managing. The act of destroying the record was an acknowledgement, by the people most embedded in the institution, that the record documented something that could not survive external examination. The Japanese government conducted a similar process. After the announcement of surrender in August 1945, Japanese military and government officials destroyed records on a scale that significantly compromised later historical reconstruction. The records of Unit 731 were destroyed. Records relating to the Comfort Women System, the institutional organization of sexual slavery that the Japanese military maintained throughout the war, were destroyed in significant quantities. The surviving records of the Comfort Women System are sufficient to document its existence, its scale, and the institutional framework through which it operated, but the systematic destruction of records means that the full institutional history, the decisions made at which levels, the involvement of which specific officials, the full geographic scope of the system, cannot be reconstructed with the completeness that the surviving German records allow for the Holocaust's administrative history. The destruction of the record was an act of institutional self-protection. It was conducted by people who understood they were managing evidence. The act of managing evidence is itself documented in some cases in the records of the destruction orders and the records of what was ordered destroyed. There is an aspect of the war's conduct on the Eastern Front that has received substantial historical attention in recent decades, but that remains inadequately integrated into broader public understanding. The conduct of German forces in the occupied Soviet Union, and particularly the conduct of the German army as distinct from the SS, was substantially more involved in the systematic killing of civilians and prisoners than the post-war framework of German military self-presentation acknowledged. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular German army had fought a conventional military war while atrocities had been carried out solely by the SS and Nazi ideological units, was a carefully managed institutional narrative that German military veterans and their supporters constructed after the war. The documentary evidence that has been examined by historians over the past several decades does not support this narrative. Army units participated in anti-partisan operations that deliberately targeted civilian populations. Army units were involved in the killing of prisoners of war in violation of international law. Army commanders issued orders directing the killing of specific categories of civilians. The Commissar Order, issued before the invasion of the Soviet Union, directed the execution of Soviet political officers captured in combat. The order was distributed through Army command channels. It was implemented, in varying degrees, by Army units. The institutional culture of the German Army on the Eastern Front accommodated practices that its post-war self-presentation denied had occurred. The documents describing these practices exist. The post-war self-presentation was not simply the individual dishonesty of veterans protecting themselves from prosecution. It was an institutional narrative, constructed and maintained by the organizations, publications, and professional networks of the post-war German military community. The war in North Africa and then in Western Europe involved another institutional reality that has been addressed historically, but that continues to sit uneasily within the framework of the Allied war effort. The treatment of colonial troops by European powers on whose behalf they fought raises questions about the institutional logic of the empires that mobilized them. France mobilized approximately 600,000 soldiers from its colonial territories in Africa, the Middle East, and other regions during the war. Britain mobilized approximately 2.5 million soldiers from India alone, along with substantial forces from Africa, the Caribbean, and other territories. The institutional framework governing the use of these forces reflected the hierarchies of the empires that deployed them. Colonial soldiers were in many cases paid less than metropolitan soldiers. They served under European officers in structures that reflected the racial hierarchies of the colonial system. When the war ended, the promises of political reform and recognition that some colonial administrators and political figures had attached to the war effort were generally not fulfilled. The institutional response of the European empires to the service of their colonial subjects was, in most cases, to attempt to restore the pre-war imperial relationships. The war that was fought, in its allied articulation, for the principles of the Atlantic Charter, including the right of peoples to choose their own government, was fought using forces drawn from populations denied self-determination by the very empires mobilizing them. The institutional incoherence of this arrangement was visible to the people experiencing it at the time. The records of colonial soldiers' correspondence, the records of colonial political movements during and immediately after the war, document an awareness among colonial subjects of the gap between the stated principles of the Allied cause and the institutional realities of the imperial system they were being asked to defend. There is a specific event in this history that sits in particularly sharp relief. In November of 1944, Senegalese tirailleurs, colonial soldiers from France's West African territories who had been prisoners of German forces and had been recently liberated, were held at a camp at Thiaroye near Dakar, in French West Africa, awaiting repatriation and payment of wages they were owed. A dispute developed over the amount they were to be paid and over the conditions of their demobilization. French military authorities responded to the dispute by ordering an assault on the camp. The exact number of soldiers killed is disputed in the historical record, with official French figures acknowledging 35 dead and other estimates suggesting significantly higher numbers. The survivors were arrested and tried. The institutional response to the killing of colonial soldiers who had survived German captivity and were demanding what they were owed was prosecution of the survivors for insubordination. The event was not widely reported in the French press. The institutional record of it was managed. The French government acknowledged the events and issued statements of recognition in 2004 and 2014, 60 years after they occurred. The administrative records of the incident remain subject to access restrictions in French archives. There is a dimension of the war's economic history that its institutional framework has never fully explained. The financing of the German war economy involved the systematic extraction and redistribution of wealth from occupied territories, from persecuted populations, and from the financial systems of conquered states. The Reichsbank received gold that had been extracted from the victims of the extermination camps, gold fillings, jewelry, and other valuables that had been collected, processed, and transferred through an administrative chain that is documented in the surviving records. The German financial institutions that processed these transfers were staffed by professional bankers operating within professional norms. The institutional framework of German banking continued to function. Accounts were maintained, transfers were processed, audits were conducted. The professional culture of the German banking sector did not experience the receipt of gold extracted from murder victims as a category of transaction that fell outside its operational parameters. It was categorized, processed, and accounted for. The post-war history of this wealth involves a complicated institutional story of its own. Looted gold and other assets made their way into the financial systems of neutral countries, particularly Switzerland, whose banking institutions processed German assets throughout the war, and whose banking secrecy laws complicated subsequent efforts to trace and recover them. The institutional framework of Swiss neutrality and Swiss banking secrecy, which had been constructed for legitimate commercial purposes, provided a mechanism through which the proceeds of systematic theft and murder were given a form of institutional legitimacy. Swiss banks settled claims related to dormant wartime accounts and looted assets through negotiations that concluded in the late 1990s. The settlements were reached through institutional processes. The institutional acknowledgement of what had occurred was partial. There is an aspect of the war's prosecution that concerns the systematic sexual violence committed against civilian populations that has received significant historical attention only in recent decades. In the occupied Soviet Union, in Poland, in Yugoslavia, in the Pacific territories under Japanese occupation, systematic sexual violence was conducted at a scale and with a degree of institutional accommodation that the post-war legal frameworks addressed only partially. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg did not explicitly charge rape as a crime against humanity, though the broader categories of crimes against humanity under which it operated could have encompassed it. The legal framework for the prosecution of systematic sexual violence as a war crime was significantly developed only after the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The institutional history of why the post-war tribunals did not more explicitly address systematic sexual violence in their charging documents is itself a story about the institutional cultures of the legal systems constructing the tribunals. The military and legal cultures represented in the tribunal's organizational structure reflected assumptions about violence and warfare that placed systematic sexual violence in a different institutional category than other forms of mass atrocity. Despite the scale at which it had occurred and the degree to which, particularly in the case of the Japanese comfort women system, it had been institutionally organized and administered. The Soviet Army's conduct during its advance into Germany in the final year of the war included systematic sexual violence against German civilian women on a scale that Soviet military records, to the extent they addressed it, categorized in ways that either obscured or minimized what had occurred. Estimates of the number of German women raped by Soviet forces during the advance into and occupation of German territory range from hundreds of thousands to over 2 million, with a wide range reflecting both the genuine difficulty of documenting events that were rarely officially reported by either victims or perpetrators and the institutional management of the historical record on the Soviet side. The Soviet institutional response to reports of the violence from within the command structure was variable. Some commanders issued orders against it. Some orders were enforced. Some were not. The institutional culture of the Soviet military and the policy frameworks governing Soviet behavior in German territory created conditions in which the violence occurred at massive scale without generating the kind of institutional response that would have interrupted it systematically. The post-war Soviet and later Russian historical treatment of the subject has been consistently minimizing. The institutional management of this aspect of the historical record has been extensive and has been conducted by the same institutional frameworks that managed other sensitive aspects of Soviet and Russian wartime history. The war produced an institutional history in Japan that parallels in some respects the German case and diverges from it in others. The post-war reconstruction of Japanese national memory around the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the central civilian experience of the war created an institutional framework of victimhood that complicated the incorporation of Japan's conduct as an aggressor and occupier into the national historical narrative. Japanese textbook controversies, diplomatic disputes with China and Korea over the content of Japanese historical education, official visits by Japanese political leaders to Yasukuni Shrine, where war dead, including convicted war criminals, are enshrined, represent not individual acts of denial, but institutional negotiations between competing frameworks for managing the historical record. The institutional framework that manages national historical memory is as deliberately constructed as any other administrative structure. It is staffed by people in positions. It produces outputs in the form of curricula, official statements, commemorations, and institutional silences. The silence about specific aspects of Japan's wartime conduct in Japanese official and educational contexts is not the absence of an institutional response. It is an institutional response. It is the institutional decision to manage the historical record in a specific way, made by people with the authority to make it, implemented through the institutions that shape public historical memory. The German case is instructive by comparison. The Federal Republic of Germany developed over decades an institutional framework for managing the historical memory of the Nazi period and the Holocaust that became, internationally, a kind of model for how a society confronts atrocities committed in its name. The framework involved memorialization, educational requirements, legal prohibitions on Holocaust denial, and institutional acknowledgement of responsibility at the highest levels of the state. This framework was not built quickly or easily. It was built through political conflict, through generational change, through pressure from Jewish communities, through diplomatic pressure from Israel and from allied governments, and through the work of historians, journalists, and institutions dedicated to documentation and education. It is a constructed institutional framework. Its construction took decades and required sustained institutional effort. The existence of this framework does not mean that the institutional culture of German society has fully processed the events it memorializes. Historians and sociologists who study German memory culture continue to document gaps, distortions, and ongoing negotiations between the framework's requirements and the experiences of individuals and communities within German society. The institutional framework for memory is itself an administrative structure with outputs that can be analyzed and assessed. Its outputs are not identical to the underlying historical reality they purport to represent. There is a dimension of the war's aftermath that concerns the displacement of populations on a scale that the post-war settlement legitimized and normalized in ways that have shaped the political geography of Europe to the present day. Between 1945 and 1950, approximately 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, primarily from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other territories that had been under German occupation or had been part of Germany before the war's territorial rearrangements. The expulsions were authorized by the Potsdam Agreement, negotiated by the Allied powers in the summer of 1945. The language of the agreement called for transfers to be conducted in an orderly and humane manner. The actual conduct of the expulsions, documented in accounts from expelled Germans and in some contemporary records, frequently did not conform to this standard. People were given hours to leave their homes. Violence accompanied many of the expulsions. Thousands of people died during the process. The institutional authorization of the Potsdam Agreement provided a legal framework that classified the expulsions as an authorized population transfer rather than a forced deportation. The legal classification determined the institutional response. What was authorized under Potsdam was processed as a post-war settlement mechanism rather than as an atrocity. The institutional framework that categorized these events shaped how they were recorded, how they were discussed, and how they were integrated into the historical narratives of the countries that conducted the expulsions. The Polish and Czechoslovak historical treatments of the expulsions and the German historical treatment of them operated from different institutional frameworks that reflected different national interests in how the events were categorized. The Allied powers that authorized the process at Potsdam had their own institutional interests in maintaining the framework of authorization that the agreement had provided. The partition of Korea, the division of Vietnam, the reorganization of Southeast Asian territories, the post-war settlements in the Middle East, including the British withdrawal from Palestine and the establishment of Israel and the beginning of the First Arab-Israeli War, all occurred within the institutional framework of the post-war settlement that the war's conclusion had created. These subsequent conflicts and territorial arrangements cannot be separated from the institutional decisions made during and immediately after the war by the Allied powers who managed the post-war reorganization of the world. The war did not end. The institutional frameworks it produced continued to generate outcomes. The territorial and political arrangements imposed or legitimized by the post-war settlement created the conditions for subsequent conflicts that continue in some cases to the present. The institutional logic that produced them was the same logic that had produced the war's prosecution. The logic of states managing populations, territories, and resources according to the interests of the institutions making the decisions, with moral frameworks applied selectively and with legal frameworks constructed to accommodate the decisions already reached. There is a final institutional reality that this narration has been tracing throughout, that can be stated now with some directness. The war ended. The fighting stopped. The surrender documents were signed. The tribunals convened, took evidence, issued verdicts, and concluded. The memorials were built. The histories were written. The institutional frameworks for managing the war's memory were constructed. And the systems that had produced the war, the state bureaucracies, the professional military structures, the intelligence services, the financial institutions, the scientific and technical establishments, the political frameworks governing the relationship between states and their populations continued to function, not unchanged. They were altered by the war and by the post-war settlements. New frameworks were imposed or constructed. New institutions were created, including the United Nations and the bodies of international law that the post-war tribunals had developed. But the fundamental institutional architecture of the world in which the war had occurred, states organized to pursue their interests, bureaucracies organized to implement the decisions of states, professional cultures organized to serve the institutions that employed them, populations organized to comply with the institutions that governed them, that architecture remained. The individuals who had operated within it during the war were replaced in most cases by individuals who had not. The institutions themselves continued. The institutions that had processed the forms, filed the reports, implemented the orders, maintained the schedules, and produced the outcomes that this narration has described were the same kind of institutions operating according to the same kind of institutional logic that continued to exist after the war ended. The paperwork continued. The desks remained occupied. The budgets were approved. The forms were signed in triplicate.